Hi, folks. With Tacitus today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this audio live stream. In this essay, I'd like to talk about the idea of the loss of neighbourhoods and the loss of social structures within neighbourhoods. Now, a huge part of that has been the forced mass migration of completely incompatible cultures against the will of the people and without the consent of the governed. So this is a key issue for discussion, debate, and examination. One that I think will be well poured over, 100 plus years from now. But also the changing structure of work and the general sort of social mobility that we see anyway, that would have occurred anyway, regardless of mass migration. So I just wanted to touch on that in particular. Now, just to illustrate the point, bear in mind, since say, my grandfather, for example, was born before the motor vehicle was around. Horse and cart was still how you did things. So he was born into the era of horse and cart and was alive when people were landing on the moon. The technological development over that time, that close on 70 years there was it was difficult to comprehend. I think people in that era, the technical developments we see now are building upon those rather than quantum leaps forward in technology. So it's a little bit different. Nonetheless, I wanted to talk about now, say my grandparents, they over their entire lifetime, including childhood, from the day they were born to the day they died, they only lived in 4 houses over that entire time. So they lived to be almost 80, so 4 houses, including again childhood. Now, similarly, they lived for the most of that, not all of it, but most of that time they lived close to other relatives. So the sister was down the road there, the brother was here, and their parents and grandparents, and so on and so on. So the wider family tended to cluster in an area, not necessarily next door to each other, although there was that too. Now, 4 houses the entire lifetime of the grandparents. Now, my parents lived in, over their entire lifetime, 9 houses. So 9 houses over their entire life. And this started, already the difference was there for the first, say, 30 years of their life, they were living close to other relatives. When I say close, the same town or the same county, that type of thing. And not necessarily the same street, but close nonetheless. And then that changed. So they lived in 9 houses over their entire lifetime. Now, so far in my lifetime, and I've still got a year or two left. There are 14 houses, so it'll probably run out to something more than that. And there'd be maybe, other than childhood, I haven't lived next to relatives for close to, as in around the corner or something like that, or even in the same city for that matter. Haven't lived close to relatives for pretty much all of that time and have moved widely, going to places that are 1,000 miles apart. So I haven't stayed in the same city or the same suburb. So this is a big change that, again, I think would have occurred, not to the entire population in the West, but would have occurred anyway to move around. One of the huge buzz factors I thought, in my late teens, very early 20s, was living in a suburb that had a hugely populated, people from all over the place, all over Australia and even other parts of the world for that matter, British tourists that were coming and going in this area. So you had all these apartments and where people were sharing. Some of the apartments were quite big and people were sharing rooms, had roommates and sharing accommodation and that sort of stuff. And people were coming and going. they'd have jobs in hospitality for, say, over the summer period, then they go somewhere else, and that was a hugely dynamic. So there's a vast number of people coming who didn't know each other. Now they're all Anglo-Saxon, they're all white and Christian and this and that. So a lot in common, as in core societal factors, a lot in common. So people could spontaneously get on in ways that you just don't see today. Not that relationships lasted long. There was a huge array of people that were having intense short-term intimate relationships, things like that would and then someone would move on somewhere else. So there was, again, this huge transient population. But it says, as a young kid, it seems to me as a buzz, there was still an element of, I wouldn't call it social cohesion, but things in common which allowed that to happen, which to some extent ran parallel to what today, or what even at the time we would have considered to be social cohesion. Now, as a kid, a young kid, I lived for years in a farming, like a rural farming village, where there were farms everywhere. Everywhere you looked, there were cows and sheep and goodness knows what. And there's only a population of 300 in this village. As a kid, the entire school. There was we would say Christian prayers, sing Christian hymns every day, and sing all things bright and beautiful, things like that. And it was, as I say, the whole sort of school was packed into, as in from 5 years old to 11 years old, was sort of packed into a couple of rooms. And it was everybody was white, and I think there was one guy's grandfather was Polish or something, but other than that, everyone was sort of British Isles Anglo, and that was the stock that was there. Now, because it was a fairly remote rural farming community, one of the more remote, there wasn't much movement. Hardly anybody moved out of that society or that village and moved to the cities to pursue careers or moved internationally. They were all very local and very, very tied to the land, as it were. And I went back there as an adult, about 30 years old, I suppose, for the first time. I had some business a few hundred miles away, and the business was concluded early, and the company I worked for had a couple of spare cars in the carpool. So I grabbed one and headed down there just simply to go back, and everything seemed so very small from what I remembered as a kid. But anyways, going back, and I spotted the people there. I remembered them from the school. Oh, that's so-and-so, that's Billy Bob, or that's Jimmy Jack, and so on. And they vaguely remembered me. Oh, yeah, I remember you. Yeah. Oh, yeah, you were Billy Bob sitting in the back row. And so, this sort of stuff. And so I was talking to them, and they had no ambition, none, zero, zip, no ambition. They lived in the house that their parents lived in. And so they had like two generations living there. They were going to inherit that house, as their parents had inherited it from the grandparents, who had inherited it from the great-grandparents, and so on. So they had no concern about mortgages or rents or anything like that. And they lived pretty much on social welfare. And when I went back, I was surprised. I was staggered, actually, at their lack of ambition. And I expected them wouldn't be super ambitious and save the world, cure for cancer, but I thought they'd have more get up and go in them than that. But they weren't moving. Their family had, and some of them could trace their family back, several hundred years, longer in some cases, or so they claimed. And they had no intention at all of moving, going anywhere, of changing anything. And they would often work as farm labourers and doing odd jobs around the farms and so on, sometimes for barter, sometimes for money, while they were collecting social welfare. But as they had no rent or mortgage or anything to pay, they could actually make ends meet quite well. Some were doing quite well. They would also pull things like, say, they'd own a shitbox car of some sort, but they'd be, say, a semi-detached house, and they'd both own it and would just use it as required. But it was an A to B rather than because they didn't commute to work and they weren't engaging in bigger ticket recreation. The car was only a means for getting from A to B. It wasn't sort of some sort of device of social prestige or something. So very different life there. And I was surprised by that. I also lived in a town of about 8,000 people, and it was quite a big town, and as in geographically, it sprawled over a wide area, and there was a lot of farms and so on there too. And so that was kind of rural, or 75% rural, I suppose. And just there, it was the same. There were a few people there that had gone to the big city to pursue the career, but not many. I easily, like kids, I used to my buddies when I was a kid. I just knocked on the doors, and I knocked on the door of a woman house where there were three brothers there, and we were all buddies and used to do all sorts of stuff together. And I knocked on the door, and she came. Now, bear in mind that I hadn't seen her for close on 20 years at this point. I'm getting on for that. So I'd gone from being a 10 or 11-year-old when I moved away to now being a 30-year-old. And I knocked on the door. The mother came to the door, looked at me within a few seconds, said, "Oh, hello, Billy Bob, how are you?" As if I'd never been away, as if nothing had happened. If it has been 5 minutes since I saw her for the last time. And I was amazed I was amazed at how that time doesn't move for these people. It stays still. And pretty much all, not all, but pretty much all the people who lived there when I was a kid were still there and hadn't gone anywhere or hadn't attempted anything. And whatever work they did do were, local bullshit jobs and so on. So, but again, there was a very, very small number of them that had to worry about rent and mortgages, which is a huge determining factor of what your cost of living is and what's affordable and what isn't. But coming to this idea of moving around for work, moving around for opportunities, moving around for better incomes, moving around to have a sense of purpose in your life, wanting to find the cure for cancer, all these sorts of things. That worked quite well, while the purchasing power of the paycheck had some gusto to it. That's all fallen to pieces now. In the sense that if somebody moves from circumstance where they don't have to pay rent or mortgage into one where they do, then their need for an income, a large income, to sustain the same more or less standard of living they would have. Bear in mind that just a sort of a one-bedroom apartment in Sydney will chew up 65% of the average wage now. And then if you look at transport, going to and from work. So if you didn't have the mortgage and the rent and the transport to and from work, that's something to worry about. The sort of clothing you need to be in the office, the amount of times you have to dry clean it, all that sort of stuff. It's something like 80% of your income's being chewed up on that. So if you look at social welfare and then working under the table at odd jobs and bits and pieces, you can easily have a better quality of life. Maybe less purpose, but how many people have jobs where they are, really doing something, building something, creating something, delivering? Very few have those sort of jobs anyway. So the social structures that underpin this go to the city, find your future, build your career, do this, that did work, and worked, I think, quite well. It was very much part of the productivity burst after World War II that we saw in the West, but only while the paycheck had the purchasing power that it had. Now the purchasing power has been so viciously reduced from where it was in, say, that the 1970s as being its high point. And these costs are the cost of food has increased at a faster rate than wages. The cost of mortgage and rents have gone wildly beyond what wages are. The cost of energy, to run your car, electricity, gas, all this thing has gone beyond wage, the growth of wages. So this is where the purchasing power of the paycheck's gone. And until it's restored, I don't believe that the engine of innovation and ambition can ever be restored until purchasing power is first restored. You've been with Tassus today at your Pushback channel, and thank you for listening.